The night she locked the door first, I was already reaching for my jacket. I stopped with one arm in the sleeve. The sound was small, a single click, the kind a lock makes when someone turns it slowly on purpose, rather than in a hurry. I had been in this office every Friday for 4 months. I knew the sounds it made. The radiator that knocked twice before settling, the elevator that ran every 20 minutes regardless of whether anyone called it. The cleaning crew that arrived at 9, always through the side entrance. I had never heard that particular click before. Catherine Cole stood with her back to me. Her hand was still on the lock. She didn't turn around immediately. She gave herself a beat, the kind of beat that meant she was deciding whether to go through with whatever she'd already decided to do. Then she turned around. She looked at me across the width of the office and said, "I didn't want us to be interrupted tonight." Her voice was completely level. It was the same voice she used to close a negotiation, the same voice she used in board presentations and difficult calls with difficult clients. The voice of a woman who had made composure into a profession. Her hands, I noticed, were not entirely still. "My name is James Calloway. I'm 36. I do financial risk analysis for a mid-sized asset management firm. Spreadsheets, probability models. The kind of work that rewards precision and punishes optimism." I had been with the company for 2 years before Catherine Cole was brought in above me as head of strategic operations, and I will be honest, I did not receive this well. Not because she wasn't qualified. She was overqualified in the way that makes other people feel the deficit. She had restructured 2 departments inside of 8 months, reduced reporting time by 30%, and had the specific quality of stillness in a room that makes everyone else sit up slightly straighter, without understanding why. She was 39. She wore her authority the way some people wear a coat they've had for years, without thinking about it, without showing it off. I had a problem with her for about 6 weeks. Then I had a different kind of problem. The shift happened in a conference room in October. We were running a Friday review. She had instituted them. All senior staff, 5:30 in the evening, which I had found unnecessary until I didn't. The others cycled out by 7. Catherine and I stayed because there was a report due Monday, and we had different readings on the same risk exposure. I thought she was underweighting a tail scenario. She thought I was assigning probability to an outcome I personally found undesirable rather than one the data supported. She was right. I knew it about 30 seconds after she said it. It took me another 10 minutes to say so, which she waited for without apparently needing to use the time. After I said it, she nodded once. She wrote something in the margin of her notes. She said, "Same time next week." And then she gathered her things and left. I sat in the conference room for a moment before I followed. Same time next week became the architecture of my autumn. Her prop was a mug. White, ceramic, a chip on the rim at the 11 o'clock position that she'd never replaced and never seemed bothered by. It sat on her desk during every Friday session, always the same spot, top right corner. Moved to the center when she was working through something difficult. Returned to the corner when she'd resolved it. I noticed this by the 2nd week. I stopped noticing that I'd noticed by the 4th. She took it black. She made it herself rather than using the office machine, which said something about her that I filed away without examining. The Fridays accumulated. We settled into a pattern that felt like a professional relationship and functioned like one, and occasionally, in the gap between one agenda item and the next, felt briefly like something else before one of us moved on. She asked precise questions. She listened to the whole answer before forming her response, which sounds like a small thing and is not a small thing. She did not perform interest. When she found an argument unconvincing, she said so, with the specificity of someone who had located exactly which load-bearing assumption was weak. I respected this before I liked her. I liked her before I understood the distinction. The moment I knew something had changed was a Friday in November, when she was working through a modeling error I'd flagged, and she reached up to push her glasses back and missed, and the gesture was so uncharacteristically imprecise that she noticed me noticing and said, without looking up, "Long week." That was all. But the admission that anything had been long, that effort was being expended, that the composure was a managed condition rather than an innate one, sat in the room differently than her other words. I said, "Me too." She nodded. We went back to the model. The room had changed slightly. I did not note this anywhere. The evidence arrived the way it usually does, in pieces, each individually reasonable, collectively impossible to explain away. The Friday before the locked door, she'd been at her window when I arrived, not working, just looking out at the street below, coffee mug in hand at the 11 o'clock chip, and she hadn't heard me come in because she was somewhere else. When she turned and saw me, she did the thing she almost never did. She looked briefly, unmistakably caught. She recovered in under a second. She said, "You're early." I was 2 minutes early. I said, "You were somewhere else." She looked at me for one beat too long and said, "I was thinking." Then she sat down and opened her laptop. 2 weeks before that, we had been wrapping up at 9 in the evening when her phone buzzed, her sister. I knew the contact name by accident, and she silenced it, without looking, and then immediately looked like she wished she hadn't done that in front of me. She picked up her coffee mug. She moved it from the corner to the center of the desk. She looked at the model we'd been running for several seconds. She said, "I should take that." She left the office to call back. I heard very little through the glass. The office had good acoustic separation, which is something I had never resented before. What I heard was one sentence when she came back in, speaking more to herself than to me. She thinks I'm not being honest with myself. She sat down. She moved the mug back to the corner. She said, "Where were we?" That is the kind of sentence that asks nothing from you and delivers everything. I noted nothing. I filed it in the same place as everything else I had been not examining for 4 months. The week before the lock, she had left for the evening while I was still running numbers, and she'd said the usual, "Lock up when you leave." But she'd stopped at the door and said, without turning around, "James." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good work tonight." It was not the first time she'd said it. It was the first time she'd said it like that, facing away, as if the door was the right amount of distance to say it from. That landed. I sat with that for an entire week. The Friday of the locked door, everything was ordinary until it wasn't. 5:30. The usual agenda, the others left in stages. Martin at 6, Donna and Priya at 7, Tom at 7:15 with the air of a man who wanted credit for staying longest and was not receiving it. By 7:30 it was us. This was normal. This was every Friday for 4 months. What was not normal was the quality of the quiet after Tom left. We worked for another hour in that quiet. It had texture to it. Catherine's mug was in the center of the desk, which meant she was working through something, and the numbers we were looking at didn't warrant it. I noted this peripherally and said nothing. At 8:40, she saved her file and closed her laptop. I reached for my jacket. The lock turned. I stopped with one arm in the sleeve. She stood with her back to me, hand on the lock, taking the beat she needed. Then she turned and said she hadn't wanted us to be interrupted tonight. And I looked at her across the office, this precise and composed woman with her chipped mug and her absolutely level voice and her hands that were not entirely still. And I said nothing for a moment, because some things deserve a moment. Then I said, "We haven't been interrupted in 4 months." She said, "No." A pause. "But tonight I wanted to make sure. I set my jacket down. I looked at her. She looked at me. The radiator knocked twice and settled. I said, "Catherine." She held my gaze. I said, "If you want to stop here, if this is just, I will follow your lead. I mean that. We go back to the model, we finish the week, nothing shifts. Whatever you want." She walked to her desk. She picked up the mug. She held it in both hands, Chip at 11 o'clock. And she looked at it rather than at me when she said, "I've given myself that option every Friday for 4 months." She set the mug down. She looked up. I stopped wanting it. Something in my chest settled into place. I crossed the office. Not fast. The kind of pace that gives a person time to change their mind, which she did not do. I stopped in front of her desk. She was looking at me in the direct, precise way she looked at things she had already made a decision about. I said, "My read on this situation, and correct me if I've mispriced the risk, is that neither of us has been looking at the model for the last 40 minutes. She said, "Your model is fine." I said, "I know." I meant the other one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Every Friday. You're the reason I didn't cancel the Fridays." She said it the way she said difficult things. Head on, no preamble. Like she'd calculated that clean delivery was less painful than any available alternative. When this started, it was about the work. It stopped being only about the work somewhere around week 3. I've been precise about everything in my professional life for 15 years, James. I have not been precise about this. That was the most I had ever heard her say about herself. I said, "I think I started arguing with you because it was the only excuse I had to be in the same room." She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but the specific quality of a person who has been holding a carefully maintained position and has just set it down. She said, "That is a terrible methodology." I said, "Statistically indefensible." She laughed. It was short and real and completely unguarded, and it sounded like the version of her that existed when she was somewhere else at a window and hadn't heard me come in. I reached out and put my hand over hers where it rested on the desk. She looked down at it. Then she turned her hand over. I said, "I don't want to complicate your professional life. That matters to me." She said, "I know. That's one of the reasons." She looked up. "One of." I learned some things in the next few minutes that I will not detail here, because they are hers as much as mine. What I will say is that there was a moment, her hand still in mine, the chipped mug at 11 o'clock on the desk beside us, the radiator doing its thing, when she looked at me with something entirely uncalibrated. And I thought, there she is. That's the one she doesn't show the room. Her phone rang. Her sister. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, "I should." I said, "Go." She took the call by the window, the same window she'd been standing at the week before, and I heard her say, "Yes, actually, I'm calling it." A pause. "No, I'm not explaining it right now." Another pause, and then quieter, because you were right. Apparently, she turned and looked at me across the office while she said it. And she was smiling in the private way, the real one, and I looked at my shoes because some things deserve privacy even in the same room. When she hung up, she said, "She's insufferable." I said, "What did she say?" Catherine picked up the chipped mug. She held it for a moment. She said I'd been in love with a spreadsheet for 4 months, and it was time to admit the spreadsheet had feelings too. I said, "I'm more of a probability model." She said, "You're both." We locked up together. She let me do it, handed me the key without being asked, which I understood to be significant in its own quiet way. 6 weeks later, Catherine told HR before I did. I found this out when my manager mentioned it with the expression of someone delivering news they had been expressly asked to deliver neutrally, and were finding this difficult. He said the firm had a disclosure policy and everything was documented and in order. I said I was aware of the policy. He said good. He seemed relieved to be finished with the sentence. The Fridays continued, different in every important way, identical in the structural ones, same agenda, same time, same two people who couldn't get the numbers right unless the other one was in the room. Her mug still moved to the center when she was working through something hard. I had stopped pretending I didn't track it. 5 months later, her sister came to dinner and spent most of it being right about things in a way I found exhausting and Catherine found vindicating. The sister looked at me at the end of the evening and said, "She said you were stubborn." I said, "She said I was precise." Her sister said, "Same thing." From her, Catherine said, "I'm right here." Her sister said, "I know. I'm talking to the spreadsheet." 2 years later, when people ask about us, Catherine tells the story efficiently and without embellishment. Late nights, a risk model. One person who finally stopped pretending the data was inconclusive. She says it like a closing statement. Clean, sourced, delivered at the right moment. She leaves out the part about her hands not being entirely still. I've never mentioned it. Some things don't need to be in the report. You just know they happened, and that they mattered, and that the room was different afterward, not because anything appeared overnight, but because two careful people finally stopped modeling the probability of something they had already, quietly, decided to let be true. What would you have done if someone you'd been spending every week with finally made it impossible to pretend it was just professional? And have you ever known something was real before you were ready to say it out loud? And what finally made you stop pretending? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.